So we last spoke a couple years ago, mostly based off of your book Sand Talk, and that was a very memorable conversation for me because I distinctly remember it kind of having a more spunky and kind of chaotic and unpredictable flavor than any other conversation that I had hosted before, in the most brilliant way. And I learned retroactively that when you had written Sand Talk, you were in a state of mania when you went through that process. And
Yeah.
so I think I'd like to start off by asking you, like, how did the aftermath of your personal reflections on the state of mind that you were in, coupled with the world's reaction to Sand
Mm.
Talk, lead you then to questions that you were curious to explore in Right Story, Wrong Story?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, when I wrote that, but when I was talking to you too, if it was like a spunky, chaotic kind of situation, then I was probably in an upswing then too. Yeah, but I hadn't been diagnosed with bipolar yet. I just thought that it was a terrible place to live in my brain. I didn't realize there was a an actual disorder going on. Yeah. Um, yeah, it was it was a struggle after that because I didn't really think many people would read the book, but it turned out a lot of people did. Like I think my crazy in the 2 weeks that I wrote it, and in the year or two building up to it, my crazy kind of landed well with everyone else's crazy in the world at the time. Yeah, so it sort of found a niche that way. But that also meant that lots of people wanted to talk to me, and so that really did unsettled things, in my
Mm.
life and in my family and all around. Yeah, and I guess the stresses of that exacerbated things with my mental illness. To the point where over that period of time in between then and now, I finished up with quite a few interactions with police and um, psych wards and prison cells and um, handcuffs and pepper spray and all that sort of stuff that comes with that.
Mm.
Yeah, and yeah, and I guess while I descended into crazy, it was everyone else was as well, because Santor came out just before COVID and the lockdowns, and lots of just the culmination of the rise of disinformation online and radicalization and Russian trolling and disinformation campaigns, etc., that sort of got everybody's kind of righteous and proper indignation and um, you know um, opposition to establishment and to you know um, the colony, the system, the everything, the global order. Um, yeah, so everybody's questioning and struggle against that. Um, just sort of culminated, but in an unhelpful sort of frame,
Mhm.
and in a sort of skewed view of reality, which I was certainly carrying around when I wrote Sand Talk. You know, yeah, and which is reflected in quite a few of the bits. Yeah, and so anyway, I felt during COVID, I kind of woke up to that because of the kinds of people who were interested in my book, and who were, I don't know, finding justifications in there, like, and kind of, savage, cool indigenous sort of support for their ideas around misogynistic ideas and, hate-based, sort of ideologies. And a lot of the just asking questions guys and all that kind of thing, who were kind of piggybacking off complexity theory and evolutionary psychology and stuff like that to try and justify some pretty horrendous MAGA kind of
Mhm.
insurrectionist ideologies, which have pretty much taken over the world now. But it was it wasn't long into COVID that I kind of realized what it was that I had sort of gotten sucked into a little bit when I was writing Sand Talk, and the kind of thinking and the kind of rhetoric and the kind of cherry picking of information. You know, do you remember the bit in Sand Talk where I was like, where I was saying, more people die of vitamin D deficiency than they do from skin cancer.
Mm.
So all the big public health, campaigns getting people to wear hats and sunscreen, these one size fits all solutions, they've actually killed more people than they've saved. Do you know what I mean? And that was me cherry picking one like really crappy research paper, and that supported my personal preference for not wearing hats because I don't like hats. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? And then I've spun that out into a whole anti public health kind of methodology that I then kind of, snuck in across the whole idea of natural medicine versus, big pharma kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which then went on to support a whole range of weird stuff. And it wasn't long into COVID that when all those sort of people went really off the leash, when I saw the extremes of it, and then I saw those patterns reflected in my thinking. And so then I went deep dive then into examining that and auditing my thinking. But that was, on a very long downswing when I like plummeted into a deep suicidal depression for a really long time. So like Sand Talk I wrote in 2 weeks, but it took nearly 2 years to write Story Wrong Story, the next one, which was very much debunking a lot of Sand Talk, or at least some of the rhetoric in it, which was sort of false, a lot of false binaries and sort of fallacies. So yeah, debunking that and sort of trying to resituate my knowledge, with the reality, and that's the Venn diagram you want to get right.
Yeah.
If your epistemology, your knowledge, your ways of thinking, and your thought processes, if that departs too far from what is real, in the world, then you can become quite dangerous.
Yeah.
A danger to yourself and others. So it's a Venn diagram. You want to keep increasing that space in the middle as much as you can. So I worked hard at that, and Right Story, Wrong Story came out of that.
Yeah.
So it's a struggle because I'm like sharing my crazy with other people who kind of have the same crazy, and then trying to work it out together. Yeah, but then
Yeah.
I've just we've got another the third book in the trilogy is coming out mid-year this year, Snake Talk, and that's a far more unified and healthy text after I've gone through my struggles of mania and vainglorious
Yeah.
expansive Sand Talk, and then a big depressed self-audit and audit of the world in geopolitics and everything else. And Right Story, Wrong Story. And now this last one is sort of medicated and Tyson and right relation with the world,
Well,
and in right relation with my partner, with my spouse too. So I'm not writing it alone. I'm co-authoring it with her. So I'm actually doing the us two thing instead of brilliant me telling everybody about how important relational pairs are in kinship and good thought. I'm actually walking my talk, so
yeah.
that
Well, I'm
helps. Yeah,
so excited for Snake Talk and when it comes out. And maybe we'll get to share a conversation dedicated towards that when the time
definitely.
feels right. But I find your humility in all of this very honorable, and I really respect that. And we'll deepen into all of this throughout
Oh,
our
it's not. That's just
conversation.
part of my
But
pathology. I have like a habitual lack of self care that's
mm,
more to do
yeah.
with my mental illness than any kind of noble,
Mm. Well, I think more
or
more
like
of us.
yeah,
Yeah.
hard won cultural humility or personal humility. Like I don't actually have that.
Mm,
I just don't really care enough about my reputation or looking after myself. I don't think that's a virtue, but thank
mm.
you.
Yeah. Well, I think more people can definitely um, take on more humility rather than self-righteousness and
Yeah.
trying to double down on their perspectives rather than,
Mm,
having the
mm,
openness to be like, wait, no, that was actually not very correct. And how can I
yeah.
kind of situate that in something bigger?
It's
And
important though to have some discernment between
mhm,
humility and sort of self sabotage or
mm,
self loathing. You know,
yeah.
yeah. I think a lot of people when they're asking cultural humility or humility,
Mm,
of a person or an ethnic group or a gender, when they're asking that, like I think they're more demanding that those people hate themselves and
mhm.
demonstrate it that way. So I think the distinction's important.
Yeah.
Like
Thank you
I
for
don't think my self-loathing and or just lack of care and willingness to examine all my shit. I don't know if that's something that should be promoted as a healthy way. I'd like
mm,
to find people who actually do have proper humility and find out what their practice is. I think that's
yeah.
you. Right.
I'm not
Anyway,
sure.
if
I'm
if I ever let
still
you talk in this conversation, then I might learn some of that from you.
mm. In a past conversation, you shared about how, in the process of writing Right Story, Wrong Story, you had several editors help you to delete portions of the manuscript that might
Oh yeah,
feel triggering for people based on your experience of having people reach out to you about having
yeah,
suicidal thoughts after they've read Sand Talk.
yeah,
And I want to, of course, honor that this is a very delicate subject and
mm,
also softly bring this into the spotlight because a lot of people do resonate with the kind of pain and suffering in the context of these times. So I'm
yeah.
curious if you can elaborate on this avatar depression that Sandtalk you saw contributed to, and how you clarified the murky lines between a sense of hopelessness that might lead to total despair if people can't
Mm,
really see a way out of the mess that we're in,
yeah.
versus a sense of hopelessness that is still brutally honest about where we
Mm.
are, but maybe keeps us wanting to stay engaged and stay with the trouble, in the words of Donna Haraway.
It's so funny to me this idea of trigger warnings that they are so linear
Mm,
that it's like like if you talk about the problems or the traumas that people have, that somehow that will exacerbate them. And so if you're talking about suicide, it's like, oh well, trigger warning, that might make suicidal people commit suicide. you
mm,
know. And I guess I only just realized this now when you were asking the question. It's weird. Sand Talk was like presenting like a beautiful worldview and showing people, what it's like to live within a sort of extended distributed consciousness, of indigenous sort of cultural modalities, Um, and there was that Avatar depression. So the same thing that happened the first time people saw Avatar, and they saw this beautiful indigenous life of blue people run around in a jungle. And they went, I want that. I'm never going to be able to have that. Oh man, I'm just going to kill myself. This world sucks. I want to live there.
mm.
And there was this actual clinical thing they were calling Avatar depression of people who weren't depressed before, but then they suddenly hated their life, their urban or suburban life. They hated it and knew they'd never escape it, and just went, ah. Um, yeah. So, but then I don't know. That made people want to kill themselves. So people were contact. I had to talk a lot of people off a lot of ledges. Like I talked to that man. I mean, I spent like a lot of time every week. For a few years. um, helping people who really struggled after the Red Sand talk and just didn't want to live in their own life anymore, but knew they couldn't live in an Aboriginal life, and how the hell are they going to survive now? And they just wanted to die. But it's weird. Nobody with Right Story, Wrong Story. It was so dark and really pressing on the sore bits, and I was in deep depression and just rolling around in there and taking the reader with me, you know, And yeah, I had two different psychologists go through and audit the whole manuscript to take out the stuff that they felt professionally was going to might be really dangerous for people to read, who were vulnerable, uh, you know, in terms of mental health. And so there was a lot taken out, but it was still dark, and there was still concerns that I might trigger people. But nobody's contacted me saying they wanted to suicide over right story, wrong story,
Mm.
which was really dark and going into the, really horrible places. But Sand Talk, like showing, the bright places and the possibilities of being human, that made people want to kill themselves. So
Yeah.
we should do trigger warning for this podcast. We should say, like, warning, you know, um, beautiful ideas about what the world could be that will make you
Mm.
feel hopeless and want to die.
Mm. Oh, yeah.
That's what the
Definitely
trigger
very
warning should be.
interesting.
Like, yeah, this film only contains happy stuff that'll, like, make you feel like your life sucks.
Yeah.
Mm.
It's interesting. I think about being on social media and where when there are these clips of maybe like a couple that are deeply romantically in love and you see the comment
Hey.
section and a lot of them are like, this just reminds me of how alone I am. So maybe it's kind of like
True
that
God.
where we kind of just because we reflect everything on ourselves.
Yeah.
So it's like, oh, that's a possibility that I don't have and that I can't have right
Maybe
now.
that's how the whole wellness industry works.
Hmm.
The kind of cult like following that wellness influencers get. Like they take care to, like, get the right spray tan and look amazing and glowing. Um,
Mm.
and I guess that makes everyone feel like shit and then go,
Yeah.
what are the supplements those people are taking? Oh,
Right.
man, I feel like
Mm.
crap. I'm going to buy all them supplements.
Yeah.
What's she telling? She's telling us to drink our own urine. All right, let's do
Uh.
that.
Well, I'm aware that in the recent years you've started getting medication for bipolar,
Mm,
and maybe you're still experimenting with what feels most supportive to you. But to this, you point out that bush medicine is for living in the bush, and that ailments from civilization require civilized medicine. And this
yeah.
kind of reminds me of a past conversation I shared with Dr. Christopher Ryan, where he talks about how modern medicine essentially is addressing a lot of the illnesses created by modern civilization. And so
Mm,
prehistoric humans didn't need modern medicine because they didn't have a lot of these diseases. And
mm,
it also reminds me of this part of your book where you write, ancient wisdom may provide examples of healthy models of governance, economies, and technologies, but these can't really help at the moment unless there's a through line to now. They can only help if examined alongside stories of development, growth, cybernetics, liberalism, modernism, and so on, end quote. And I think this is trying to get at the need to contextualize. And I'm also curious if we need to meet a lot of modern ailments with medicine from modern civilization, then like what is the modern medicine that civilization itself needs to be met and medicated with?
yeah. There's this almost leap of faith sort of thing in,
Mm.
in sort of complexity science and systems thinking. When you start to understand complex, adaptive, self-organizing systems, um, yeah, you see this pattern again and again, where the system, when there's a disruption or a threat to the system, um, and the system becomes destabilized, that it throws up like an immunological response at some stage, like something will arise within that system, that will sort of combat the virus or whatever is introduced to the system. That there's always that kind of response with the self-organizing system, and it's, I don't know, it's almost spiritual, and then you kind of, you know some people will sort of have a faith in that. Yeah. But it can also just be a good basis for inquiry, so that, when you're looking at systemic problems, that you're keeping an eye open for what are the, little strange attractors propping up that might produce really out of the box solutions that don't seem obvious initially, but will have those knock on effects that will spread through the entire system and stabilize it or adapt it and change it, make those mutations, that actually sort of come into balance with everything that's in relation across that system. You know, um, yeah,
Is this kind of like going into your analogy where you say, now we finally arrived to dismantle the master's house using the master's tools, but
mm,
he doesn't live here anymore. So, like, maybe we can't take down the master's concrete high rise buildings with spears and sticks and
yeah,
stones. And maybe now we can use the dozers to take it down. But then you say he doesn't live here anymore. He's buying up water rights and spearheading land grabs elsewhere. He hopes we'll tear down his house because it's insured for more than he could get from selling the place, and on and
yeah,
on. So it's kind of like now we're adapted to being able to work with this system, but whatever we're trying to toss
yeah,
out as solutions is already like kind of integrated into what the system can handle.
yeah. Well, it's like our entire focus, in kind of like the academic idea of decolonizing and decolonization, post-colonialism, post, all that, the post-colonial theory, post-structuralism, all this kind of thing. It's like we were just wanting to tweak the culture or decorate the culture with bits and pieces of sparkly inclusivity,
Mhm.
and that would somehow change the system. And I guess we're finding out now that that's not what the power structures are based on. So yesterday I was sitting down with an Indian academic, um, at my university. We're looking at working on a research project together, and but she's working on a project for Indigenous domestic violence, and she was telling me all of the things they're looking at, like all the standard stuff that's in the research about domestic violence and Indigenous domestic violence, and what they're looking at to address and start up, different projects and interventions, and et cetera, et cetera, to actually deal with this problem, from the grassroots in the community up, which sounds really good.
Mm.
But, um, she asked for off record, what the realities are of domestic violence. And I gave her all those things. And the more we went into it, the more it just seems like such a tangled mess that can never be untangled,
Mm.
and it moved into, Aboriginal men and women and their experience, of and patterns of behavior that we use to survive, during this occupation of our land, which will never end. So the idea of a post-colonial is ridiculous. And then she's from India, so she's in post-colonial India, and with the knowledge that the British only left India when they could see that the people of India could become self-colonizing subjects who
Mm.
would keep extracting from their land and oppressing each other, in order to keep sending those resources and riches, back to Britain
Mm.
and to the US. Yeah.
Is
So
this kind of like a
so it,
monodirectional trend?
yes. So there's like corporate ownership of India,
Mm.
but no foreign governance of. So foreigners still get to own it. The colonizers still get to own everything, but they don't have the responsibility of managing it. They just get passive income from it. You know what I mean?
Mm.
And the people are self-colonizing. Well, so we're looking at that best case scenario for Indigenous communities, and Indigenous sovereignty, self-governance. Potentially, would that be a way? Is self-determination part of, sorting out the problems of domestic violence? But even that, when we looked at the trajectory of India, and that was part of the post-World War II order. But then now we've got a whole new world order coming out that is moving back towards multipolarity. So a multipolar world, where there aren't these big, treaties and alliances, but it's every man for himself, um, with the big dogs dominating, more so than ever. So we looked at that and what this new colonization era will look like, and what sovereignty could mean there. And then every time we scaled out and scaled back in to the problem of domestic violence, we only saw the causes and the desperation, and our only possible survival responses to those being ones that would exacerbate domestic violence for Indigenous men and women. And we went through every possible permutation and arrived at the conclusion that, the only thing we can do to end domestic violence in our communities would be to end capital. So it keeps coming back to, like, in the end, the structures and caste system that is required to enforce capitalism, not just in India but everywhere. The inequality that's needed, the desperation that's needed in order to make sure the demand exceeds supply, so that our GDP can grow every year.
Right.
That requires a lot of people living in misery and increasing numbers every year. And part of making that happen and stopping people from getting their shit together at the bottom of society is domestic violence as part of it. So there is a big incentive within the system for that self-organizing system to keep perpetuating the worst parts of our lives that we cannot address just through research interventions or policy interventions or program interventions. The only way you could take that pressure off is to end capitalism. And we were talking about it like getting out of the shower and grabbing a towel and deciding that the best way to dry yourself would be starting with the feet. And so you dry your feet, and then all the water runs down from your hair and down from your body and wets your feet again. And then you keep drying your feet over and over, going, God, if we just have to address this domestic violence. But, in the end, you've got a big head full of wet hair, which is capitalism. That's going to keep dropping that water down on you.
Yeah. It's like the very foundation, right? And the logic wired into the system. So unless you can address those foundations, you're kind of just, they say, rearranging chairs on a sinking ship. Like, unless you can actually get to the roots of everything. A lot of the nonprofit industrial complex, like philanthropy, trying to work within these systems, very limited in terms of being able to address the roots.
It really is, but even the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous voices in that space, particularly in the sort of regenerative finance and green finance sort of side of things, and sustainability side of philanthropy. Everybody wants to center Native voices there, and but also have consultations with Indigenous people and to try and do co-design systems of finance and even alternative economies and circular economies for sustainability, and different ways to do offsets and trading schemes that places a dollar value on everything in nature and therefore preserves it.
Rights of rivers.
They want Indigenous knowledge in there, and they are consulting with us, and they want to bring us in all the time for these things. And a lot of us are happy to be brought in, but we have found, like, over the last sort of 5 years of that being a really big, trendy, popular thing to do. People like to have that branding on their website. Hey, we are Indigenous knowledge centered, but centered. It should be just centered. We're Indigenous knowledge centered. SCENTED. Smells like Indigenous knowledge. It's a little lemon myrtle potpourri in there, and we tend to find that they will cherry pick and take bits of our knowledge and then kind of drop us like a hot potato and then run around with those things just for their branding, or we will build the whole program for them that they are presenting to us as something that we all own collectively, and so we will, bring people in, and we'll invest all of our time and our lives and effort and all of our work. We'll bring that in and put it into a commons here all together. And then you find out that, so what's the mechanism for ownership here? Oh, it's this philanthropist's private company, which is a consulting firm. and they now own all of our IP. And I even had one of them asserting to us that they owned our relationships,
Mm.
and that
Wow.
we weren't allowed to speak to each other without informing what was essentially a white manager, informing them that we were speaking and then what we were speaking about, and that anything that we, the relationship itself, but anything that we talked about belonged to their private business. Yeah, and yeah, when I questioned that, that person started screaming at me about reverse racism and that
Mm.
I was colonizing them,
Mm.
and that we as Indigenous people were colonizing that white philanthropist business owner. It was just like, what? Oh my
Yeah.
goodness.
And this is what you say to watch out for is when the people doing the oppressing kind of flip the script to
Oh yeah,
self-victimize
that's the
and say
fascist
that you're the
turn.
one doing it to them.
Yeah, that's the fascist turn. When the people you're oppressing,
Mm.
you decide to start portraying them as your oppressor.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
I want to kind of weave this into because a lot of this is about like selectively choosing which parts of, for example, certain people's knowledge to incorporate and what to leave out. And a lot of this is about context. So I
Mm,
kind of want to bring this back to you and how you share about how in your community you're known in part as being hearing impaired and
mm,
crazy, where you know you're capable of moments of brilliance, but you also know you can't be trusted in certain ways to contribute to governance because you don't leave altered states of mind after ceremony.
yeah.
And this makes me think about how none of us are really meant to be trusted in every context and capacity.
Yes.
And like, what if all of our stories and sayings came with pretext? Like,
Mm,
I proposed this idea at a time when I was feeling hurt and revengeful. So, like,
yep.
that's the context that, people should keep in mind. Or I
Yeah.
feel a need to control and hoard things because I grew up with scarcity and I'm operating from mentalities of fear. So,
Yeah.
there might be elements of truth across all of these stories, but like
Mm,
you share, right story in the wrong place is a wrong story. And
yeah.
maybe this is kind of just all a part of the ailment of the system in that it
Mm,
rejects neurodiversity and context and really props up
that's
the
it.
monocultural delusion of separation and endless
Yeah.
growth. But
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know that it's a really ableist thing to say, about myself, that I should not have any decision making authority. Um, that doesn't mean I can't, um, put my ideas and knowledge forward to influence decision making or inform decision making, of people who are more stable than me. But I should not have my hand on the button. you know, Maybe no one should. I mean, you think about it, every state of mind is in one way or another an altered state,
mhm,
So I think the good analogy would be that Venn diagram again of a tangible reality, a material reality, and then your way of thinking, your mind, um, yeah, your knowledge processes, and that should overlap as much as possible with the tangible reality. And you can't do that on your own. You have to do that collectively and be checking in all the time. In ceremony, those two circles separate completely
mm,
because we're in an agreement that we're going to come into spirit world here, that we're going to move ourselves outside of the tangible reality and bring ourselves into that other world, you
yeah.
know.
I want to ask you more about
And we do that
this.
together, so our
Yeah.
mind shifts and we're in a very altered state. For when crazy people like me, you're constantly in an altered state. Your circles are often separated, and then they may not overlap as much.
Mm,
But I mean, the gift of that is, that there are interesting things, inputs
mm,
coming from you or outputs. You know what I mean? Like
yeah.
that. Many could be ignored, but it's if you listen to that marginal stuff, there's every now and then like amazing sort of sparks of ideas will come out, and maybe that's the immunological response of a system that's unstable. Maybe that could
Mm,
be found there. But the person that's spitting these things out all the time, they shouldn't decide which one is the relevant and helpful
mm,
one, because they're not there. They're not in this reality.
mhm.
So I mean, I think that's really important. There was
Yeah.
another part of what you were saying there. I think I was moving towards that,
Um,
but yeah, I was
yeah, maybe
very
just
strong. We
this
might come back to that.
system kind of propping up this monocultural delusion, and rather than
Yeah, yeah,
honoring neurodiversity and that there's different contexts and spaces for different people's brilliance
yes,
to shine in particular ways, we're kind of like the system props up a lot of narcissistic tendencies, and
yeah,
arguably the system itself is also narcissistic in many ways.
yeah,
But yeah, instead of like
yeah,
honoring the range of diversity that everybody is able to contribute to, it kind of um,
yeah,
is really narrow in what it
yeah.
rewards and
And
elevates.
a good way to accurately map the material reality is to include everybody's viewpoint as a data set, and like find in the aggregate of that, um, find things that you can test, and um, test, like compare it with the other things, find internal cohesion of that logic, um, by removing elements, and trying different things out in the system to see if these ideas work, again and again and again every time, then you can get a more accurate model of reality like that. But the unfortunately, that idea of collectively doing that um, is actually made a post-truth reality where everybody's point of view is, it's possible for that to be, no, well, that's my alternative facts,
Mm.
and you get to just debate me, bro. And
Mm.
if you've got the dirtiest tricks in debate, and the stupidest ways of putting stuff across that appeals to people's misconception of what common sense is, then you can promote a very skewed view of reality that you don't even hold, but
Mhm.
that's just supporting some really shitty agenda that you have. and
Yeah.
and that's why you find those things are winning. And we're finding that altered states, or even pretended altered states, and views of reality, are actually gaining supremacy in a world that's increasingly seeking supremacy.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, this makes me think about diversity in thought in more nuanced ways. I remember you talking about how we perceive the location of the moon, and if you have people scattered along the beach, everyone's going to have a slightly different perception of where the moon is, but it's the aggregate of all of their stories and perceptions that approximate reality of where the moon is. So that
yeah,
diversity in perspectives is crucial for us to arrive at a
mm,
sort of meta story of what is really going on. But I'm
yeah,
thinking about how a lot of diversity in thought, like you touched on just then, fruiting from these times, aren't really grounded in relationship to land and to laws of the land.
mm,
So instead of people actually sharing stories about where they see the moon, maybe some people are arguing over like whether that star over there is actually the real moon, or like whether the
yeah,
moon even exists or is just a mirage and conspiracy. And so the
yeah,
aggregate of this ungrounded diversity in thought actually doesn't help us to average out to a meta
yeah,
story of right stories that
yeah.
approximate truth. So, yeah, I'm curious what else
Well,
comes up for you when you talk about, or when people talk about freedom of speech and
mm.
diversity in thought.
Well, this is the danger of in English. So I talk about aggregate. The idea of aggregate data, and finding an average that sort of works most of the time for most people. That's a bell curve, and if you're doing an analysis of a distribution like that, the outliers are important. On the left and the right. um, and the outliers will tell you things that are interesting about the rest of the distribution. But there's also such thing as a skewed distribution. Your bell curve isn't always like a beautiful hill. Sometimes it just leans right off to the side, and gets skewed one way or another. So your average is pulled, um, by, um, like sort of viral,
Hmm.
viral outliers out on the fringes can actually end up pulling the average and skewing the distribution to lean right over. And I guess in those cases, the aggregate is not helping. But that's why your specialists are needed. Knowledge isn't just a democratic process where everyone votes on what their preferred reality is, because pretty soon everything will be dead if you do that. You need to have specialists that are respected. So the people on the beach deciding where the moon reflection is, and then learning, oh no, it's actually reflecting on all the ocean at once. Yeah, that's a good thing for everyone to arrive at, and that aligns with the reality. But if that same group of people then, with their limited knowledge of the moon, then decide that they want to predict where the moon is going to rise the following night, um, for a night fishing expedition,
Mm.
um, and they use the same process, then you'd end up with a lot of drowned people that
Mm.
next night, because you need to then listen to your experts,
Right.
because
Yeah.
old woman over there, she actually knows all the lunar cycles, and she
Mm.
happens to know that that ring that we're seeing around the moon tonight, that means there will be a king tide tomorrow, and that's not going to be a good time for us to paddle out into the dark. you
Yeah.
know so
Yeah.
yeah, but this kind of democratization of common sense, and then elevation of that above everything else, means that we are dismissing those aunties
Mm-hmm.
slash scientists slash
Yeah.
scientific consensus, those specialist points of view of people who, they hold that knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And in our
Yeah.
indigenous societies, everybody has a specialization, and the people who speak for those specializations and have the best knowledge about them, they're the ones you listen to in the context. Hey, that's the thing that you said before that I was trying to remember. um,
Mm.
yeah, the
Context.
context dependence, with these altered states, and what you choose to yeah to highlight and follow and include from moment to
Yeah.
moment. It is context dependent. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I do think about how a lot of places that are so-called democracies are not actually true democracies right now. But even if people in these democratic places were to have, even if everyone were to have equal weight in their votes, like I don't know if we would be able to actually vote towards like a more regenerative and healthy planet, because our understanding of what that actually takes is so
Mm,
skewed based on like
mm,
mainstream education and um, colonized minds and
yeah.
worldviews and so forth. So I think what you're
It,
saying
it that would
is,
only
yeah,
work. That would
crucial.
only work if there was some kind of regulatory control on a monopolization of influence
Mm,
by any particular power group.
right.
Then there would be a chance then for people to coalesce around. If everybody then would actually seek the advice of specialists, and they would
Mm,
want to see their credentials and their track record,
yeah.
of how
So
many times
information.
they got it right, and then people
Yeah,
would
yeah, yeah.
elevate those people and look at all the nuances of that. But nobody's doing that.
Right.
People are just listening to many, many, many hours of shitty influencers who have
Mm,
an agenda that's actually not actually in the interest of the people that are following them.
right. Yeah.
And those
So we
those
have a
interests and agendas are hidden. So it's not possible in an information landscape
right.
that is completely monopolized, dominated by bad actors with very huge agendas.
Hmm.
Billionaires who do not, they do not have a national identity. They're existing outside of you know the order of sovereignties that we're currently in, and they can do it. Yeah, and they're just leaning people towards whatever their goals are,
Yeah. So the
which are not
precondition
good.
of a healthy democracy is also the democratization of information and media and
Yeah,
storytelling.
yeah.
And to come back to context, you talk about how altered states are meant to be secret, sacred, and in ceremony, and they're not meant to cross over into the mundane. And I think I'm curious about this because I wonder about how it relates to worldviews of separation and compartmentalizing everything, and that being part of the issue. And maybe to see sacredness, for example, in all life
Mm,
and in everything is
mm,
different than having altered states of mind everywhere.
yeah,
But
yeah.
then what role do these altered states of mind serve if they're meant to be
Mm,
kind of contained and separated? And then what
yeah.
aspects about them are meant to spill over, maybe to
Well,
yeah.
there's capital C sort of ceremony,
Mm,
and that's that collective process of going passing into that other world, you know, while still retaining form in this world, um, that's pretty full on. It's a dangerous place to be, so you have to have good tradition and good people, you know, um, thinking together as one. Otherwise, you can be harmed there. You can bring things back from there, yeah.
mm,
And when you come back, so I mean, you set circle at the start, for protection and to create that sacred space, and then you have someone who keeps circle, so someone who watches the fire, maintains the fire, and is very vigilant about the border around the ceremony, where things can come through and things can go out, but these things need to be observed, and then you have closing circle, where you finish the ceremony, you restore people, back to the real, and you sweep that space, that ceremony space away, so it's not left open for other things to keep following us back to this side. This is all really important, and that's sort of big C ceremony. And why you may not carry the altered state back here, that doesn't mean you can't carry the knowledge gained,
mm,
the inspiration, the illumination, the realizations that you have in ceremony, the common understandings and values, practices, all these sorts of things, and you can continue to maintain that feeling and that connection to the wisdom that comes from ceremony. You can do that through your ritual, all day. Like you might have a ritual of, if you pass a tree, if you pass by a tree, you might greet that tree. That's a ritual.
mm,
It doesn't produce an altered state of consciousness for you, but it allows you to walk in the sacred with a reverence for the sacred.
mm,
Like when people in Mesoamerica are planting corn, and you know um, they're acknowledging the four directions, elements, and Quetzalcoatl or whatever while they're doing it, and then they make that four-part, a ritual into an algorithm for the planting of the corn and the patterns of the planting that happen to align with the natural system and the biology of the place and the patterns of spirit in the land. That's great. They're not disappearing from this world in their consciousness while they're doing that. They are present, and that ritual grounds them in the sacredness that they learn in ceremony.
mm.
The knowledge that they learn from that big feathered serpent, who teaches them the wisdom of the three sisters and when to plant and how to plant and the patterns of relation, there,
Yeah.
and how to make, something like a civilization sustainable, within a healthy landscape. That's like Quetzalcoatl's role, there. Um, you know, so they're not coming back. Yeah, they're not bringing the altered state back from ceremony.
Mm,
But there's a difference between ceremony and ritual. And our rituals, like even a prayer before a meal or whatever like that, this is something that just grounds you in the sacred and is a callback to ceremony and ceremonial states.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, it should not inform your thinking.
Mm,
The ecstatic stuff you do in church, in the Bible passages that have set you on fire during that sermon, you should not come back and actually make that inform your policy on women's health, for example, without consideration of any other data or the lives or the impacts that's going to have on people's lives. How
mm,
many women are going to die of sepsis because of your divinely inspired knowledge from ceremony in church? Do you know what I mean?
mm.
They,
Comes back
when
to
you do that,
context.
when you bring back altered states from ceremony, you
Hmm.
kill, you harm, you damage, you undo creation. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I hear context context underlying
Yo,
a
yeah,
lot of this conversation,
yeah,
and I also want to bring in this quote that you share where you write, cultural longevity is important, but living cultures must always adapt to current contexts and remain fluid enough for continual emergence, end
yeah,
quote. And I think I'm curious to go a bit deeper into rooting our lives in relation to the land when the laws of the land are also ever changing and
yeah,
co-iterative.
yeah,
And here I think about some of the work of native habitat regeneration and reforestation that I'm
mm,
engaged in, and how it often feels like an upwards battle because a lot of the introduced grasses and weeds to this
mm,
particular bioregion that are considered invasive just they grow a lot faster, they proliferate like crazy, much faster than the native understory shrubs and trees of
mm,
the
mm,
rainforest and the wet forest. And so sometimes I do pause and reflect, like, what are we doing if it requires so much energy input to regularly run these huge tractors, bush hogs, and other heavy machinery just to try to maintain a sort of pristine or illusion of pristine in this
mm,
particular fenced off pocket of
yeah,
space?
yeah,
And what are we doing if the work of protecting the land here relies heavily on fuel made possible through like oil drilling or open pit mining and the devastation of lands elsewhere?
yeah.
And is this fixation on rushing towards um, some outcome and
It's
trying
like
to
those
control something like also something
life
that
size
we need to
dioramas
examine?
in a museum. Hey,
Mm,
where they have like a dinosaur scene and they've recreated
mm.
the ecosystem from then and the dinosaurs in it, or cavemen, or you know zebras or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I felt like there was more coming at the end
Oh no,
there.
I think
That
just like
image just
these
came into my mind.
Yeah, these questions kind of just come up for me, and I know I feel
Mm,
uncomfortable sitting with them because they do challenge my
yeah,
perspectives and I don't
yeah,
have the answer. But it does make me ask, like, what is the difference between honoring cultures and lands as continually emerging and changing
mm,
and letting that all be messy versus
yeah.
problematizing other forms of change as disruptive or invasive and not life affirming? So, like,
Well,
how do we root ourselves not in some pure, pristine past and also not in some
yes.
disoriented illusion of the
Mm,
present, but in a more real present that is also already transformed and will keep transforming?
mm. I'm so glad, like in this yarn, the gift you brought of centering the concept of context, of seeding
Mm,
that in there and keeping that there to trouble what we're saying, because I think that's the most important thing. So indigenous cultures, or even what we've referred to as the global south, it's we've got the global south and the global north, and generally speaking, on the bell curve, in the distribution, in the global south, our cultures tend to be, like the cultures that are indigenous to the global south. We tend to be more high context cultures, field dependent,
mm,
cognition, everything depends on the context. Um, yeah, so we have a situational bias towards like causality, and behavior. So it will judge actions based on the situation, rather than the dispositional bias, where it's assumed to be an integral part of that person. If they behaved like this, then that's the kind of person they are.
mm,
Or if this weather event happened, then that's the kind of climate that's here. You know
mm,
what I mean? And that's more an orientation of the Northern Hemisphere, which tends to be low context cultures. Um, but at the same time, there is a lot of the global North and the global South. You know, a lot of them live here. And a lot of the cultures and economies of the global North dominate the global South. Also, because of that extractive action and all the resources flowing towards the global north, a lot of our peoples and communities and cultures have followed those resources
mm,
because they have to survive. And so a lot of us are in the global north now and we influence them a lot, you know. So, and it's not even this little fleck like yin and yang. It's, there is a real swell of north in the south and south in the north. So yeah, you can't make generalizations, and you have to look at what is, and you have to look at the true context, which is not a melting pot but a mosaic, going on. So, and that pattern, you follow that into your land regeneration,
Yeah.
efforts. And what's the most important thing there is Indigenous forms of embassy, particularly Indigenous norms and practices, processes, protocols around border work. That border work's really important. Every system, it has boundaries, but those boundaries are fluid, and there must be things to flow through that system, like migratory animals. People talk about the biodiversity of a region, that this region has these components for its biodiversity. But the fact
Mm-hmm.
is, every season that changes.
Mm-hmm.
Most of those species will migrate out of that system at different times and return back through. And it's important for them to move through the other systems they move through. Wind and water flows, flows of airborne dirt, all kinds of different things, insect climates. These things are always moving and flowing across systems. But more importantly, humans in diaspora and journeying humans,
Mm-hmm.
go across those borders, and they bring non-human kin with them as seeds and as animal companions, as well. And those animals come into there, and they can be a problem if they're not welcomed properly, if they're not managed properly into that system. So there has to be kin making that happens. If new species come in, they need to become totems for people who understand the land and who can manage those species relationships there, um, which is something that we all have. So, like we have an Indigenous embassy, with Indigenous people in Ecuador, for example, for the gum trees, the eucalypts from Australia that have been planted there, and also for their cane toads that are introduced here and are sort of regarded as a pest. So we do lots of ceremony with them, and different knowledge and things like that we exchange um, to shed light on how we need to what we need to do to come into better relation with these plants that have come from
Mm-hmm.
abroad. So I've been doing that a lot in my practice. With carving as well. I've been carving with a lot of what they call weed species, invasive pests. I've been carving with those woods a lot, with privet and with what's that one from the Iberian Peninsula? It's gone from my head. White poplar. I've been carving with white poplar, which is an invasive pest, but potentially could actually be really helpful with managing how fire moves
Mm-hmm.
through our country here, because it's a very fire resistant wood, which is why they use it for matchsticks. But it's a problem here along waterways because it's also thirsty. So we have to bring it into relation through by creating symbioses between that and other species.
Yeah.
And we need to do that for the wildcats, for the foxes, for all these things. How to bring them into relation, into a stable, what they call in biology, naturalized. But I
Mm-hmm.
think there's a lot of migrant populations who wouldn't be happy with that word. But yeah,
Mm.
the idea of
Yeah.
when you bring something that's not endogenous to a place, when it comes in and over time becomes part of that system in a way that the system will depend on it because it's interdependently woven in through different symbioses,
Yeah.
and that's when that population will settle down and stop behaving invasively and
Mm.
actually become part of it, become autochthonous and then eventually indigenous to place.
Mm.
And so and when working with our non-human kin, plants and animals, this helps us with processes and time frames and attitudes and border work protocols that we need to apply to our human kin who don't come from here as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot here, and I really appreciate you bringing all these threads in this conversation.
Mm.
It makes me think about my most recent discussion with Serene Thin Elk, where we talk about
Mm.
this question of if truly holistic medicine is tied to culture, to land, to community, to place, then what does it mean for us to heal in like a vastly diasporic and uprooted world? Because that's the reality of the world today. A lot of people are born into places where we might not have deep ancestral roots. A lot of
Mm.
people were forcibly displaced. A lot of people have chosen to relocate out of free will. And a lot of people are also um, were also born into places or grew up in homes and spaces where they don't necessarily feel like are safe for them to find healing within. So
Mm.
this question of like how do we rebuild community in really diasporic worlds is one that I
Yep.
continue to think about. And as we kind of come to a close here, I want to invite you to elaborate on this question.
Mm.
Also,
Yes.
in the context of cities where people might feel maybe just more layers of separation from
Mm.
their food, their water, fuel, and other land based relationships. So, like, how
Mm.
can people re nurture these webs of relations in places
Mm.
where maybe the laws of cities and the metropolis and urbanization have been imposed on top of underlying laws
Mm.
of the land,
Mm.
all the while not reinforcing this binary of natural versus unnatural or wild versus not wild?
Well, it's very simple. We need to stop thinking about health and talking about health and wellness.
Mm,
These are individualized things where people hope to, get some sort of competitive edge on everybody else. And once it's a short step from that to eugenics. And there's a lot of really eugenics adjacent philosophies in the wellness industry, and especially with wellness influencers, and and going through all the practices and supplements and traditions. These become cults that end up
mm,
looking like eugenics. Yeah, we need to move away from personal ideas of health, that each of us as a self-managing neoliberal subject will um, be responsible for making ourselves capable of optimal performance in service of the glorious nation, or the glorious ethno-state, or the glorious religion that we follow, or whatever. That's all really dangerous shit that makes really genocidal public health policies and movements. Okay, so what would replace that? Because we still want to be healthy. So what do we talk about instead? We need to talk about care. We need to
mm,
replace the words health and wellness with care. Um, how are we caring for each other? How are we accessing care? How are we accessing care in the community, not just from government institutions that are unstable because they're constantly under attack? Um, and privatization, deregulation are always shaking these institutions to their foundations so that we cannot rely on them for care. So how do we create communities and economies of care? So, and I'm not talking about institutional economies, like economies within a state. I'm talking about our black market economies, like our informal human economies. The networks that endure after a major disruption to a economic system. Yeah, what are our informal economies of care in our communities? Can we develop those to the point where we can trust them and know that if we fall, we're going to be caught? You know, um, yeah. How are we going to be in a position where, I mean, how many people in the world have to wipe the ass of a relative who's incapable of wiping their own ass? Um, Everybody should be wiping somebody's ass
mm.
who's sick, because with the sure knowledge that one day someone will need to wipe yours. You're going to be sick one day. You're going to be old one day. Um, you're going to be um, your ability is going to be diminished. So how do we do care? And I think when we end up with that, when we end up with communities and economies of care that actually honor the work of the carers who currently do that as slaves for free in this world, and who are diminished and diminishing, and have never
So I
been
guess
honoured
we
or
did.
respected, then yeah, if we can do
Yeah.
that, if we can, honour the carers, and everybody becomes carers, and everybody, creates systems of care that extend to our non-human kin into the landscape, and we start talking about care as our obligation, our duty, our love of life, and our project, our goal is care, communities of care, economies of care. Once you start
Mm.
doing that, then healthy systems, habitats that we live in, will come from that, and personal health will come from that. But
Yeah.
it's hard because you have to, only create a system like that if everybody is putting in more than they expect to get back uh, in the short term. It's over the long term, over a lifetime, that a system of abundance that you're putting everything into will give you back more than everybody back more than they ever put in. That's the magic of increase. That's the magic of a commons
Mm.
that is sustained as a complex system with custodians. It gives back more than what everybody puts in. And that's the magic of that. And that is not systems health. That is not personal wellness or development. That's just care. That's systems of care. So I'd recommend a shift to that.
Mm. I was going
Mm.
to say that we did, after all, circle back to feces in the face
We
from the
did.
beginning of our conversation or
I'm not sure.
pre-recording.
Yeah, we weren't recording that, but yes,
Yeah.
I have. I've been very humbled this week by receiving a face full of caca a couple of days ago. It will really give you perspective, that one,
Mm.
especially if your mouth was open
Mm.
and
Yeah.
your eyes were open.
And I'll close off on this quote that you share, that your final words of wisdom reminded me of, which is that apocalypses are unsettling things, but they become much more interesting if you have prep by stockpiling relationships rather than guns, gold, and vitamin supplements. So I
Beautiful,
think that kind of,
bankable meme, that one.
yeah.
Yeah, fridge
So
magnet quote.
yeah. With that, I want to invite you to share anything else on your mind that I didn't get to ask you about, and any final words of guidance you'd like to
Mm.
share with our listeners.
I think where we ended up, and like I think with how you guided us and centered us around that idea of always coming back to context as a way to align our thinking as much as possible with the complex reality. I think that's what's brought us around to a pretty good conclusion of starting to move our focus together towards economies of care and communities of care rather than individual wellness and well-being. I think that's a very, very good place to leave it. It solves a lot of my own questions around, oh my God, how do we get past this system of capital?
Mm.
I guess we do that.